It's a great pleasure to introduce Thomas Parr today. Very briefly about his background. So he started medical school in 2012, I guess, yeah, at the UCL, and did also like a bachelor there with a focus in neuroscience. In 2016, he started his PhD. I hope it's everything is correct. He started his PhD
right.
working together with Carl Friston and Garen Rees. So I think Thomas is really like the person who most frustrated me. Yeah, when I was at the Phil, yeah, so a long time ago, I was fascinated by like the idea of the free energy principle and Carl Friston, and really started going learning about Boltzmann equations and some kind of like methods passing and so on and so forth. Yeah, and over years and years, and then in 2016-17, I realized that suddenly a number of papers were coming out which became much more accessible. And on these papers, there were always like one name, yeah, Thomas Parr. And so I looked into that, and I realized that there is one person out there who is so young and who just started his PhD, and who's able to go all through this extremely complicated math and ideas so easily, yeah, that I thought I should really give up thinking about the free energy principle at all. And more impressively, I think a couple of months ago, even like a book came out, like about like active inference, where he is like the first author on, and I really can recommend this book. It's a fantastic introduction to active inference, to the free energy principle. So it's a really great pleasure to have you here tonight, Thomas, and I'm really looking forward to your talk. Yeah, thanks for joining. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for the very nice the invitation and the very nice introduction as well. First of all, can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. And next thing is to see whether I can successfully share my screen. Let's try this. So I'm assuming you can see the PowerPoint and now hopefully in full screen.
Perfect.
Great. So today I realize that you've already had a talk from Ryan Smith previously, so I'm assuming he's given an excellent overview of active inferences, as he always does. And I wanted to take the opportunity to focus in on something a little bit more specific in this talk, which is thinking about how dealing with active inference lets us think about neurobiology and how we can start to make connections and form neurobiological theories from the principles. So I'll start just by giving an introduction that I think will hopefully give everybody who a little bit of a refresher on active inference and the basic principles. And although there are some technical elements to it, I'll try to make it as intuitive as possible. And it really doesn't matter if you get all of the technical detail through this. It's just to hope to build some intuitions. So I tend to like to start talks with this slide, which just shows two different sorts of system. The one on the left is one that just gradually diffuses over time, sort of loses form, becomes progressively less interesting. Whereas the one on the right, despite having the same amount of randomness built into it, manages to maintain its form over time. And a useful starting point in thinking about active inference is thinking about what the difference between these two sorts of systems are, and how the one on the right is able to maintain its form and resist this diffusive the effect of these random fluctuations that are forcing it in all sorts of different directions. And it's often useful to reformulate this in terms of the probability density or the change in the probability distribution of all of these little particles over time. So again, you can see on the left we've got something that's just diffusing out into nothing, and on the right we get something that behaves from a probabilistic level pretty much statically. And it's really those on the right that we're interested in. Those biological creatures are able to maintain their form, are able to resist the effects of what the environment does to them. Now, if we sort of write down the kinds of dynamics that we need for a single particle or single part of this system to try and maintain this form, what we get to is a system that I think quite intuitively always moves, when it can, from regions of low probability to regions of high probability. So if we interpret this final distribution it gets to as some steady state, all we need to do to maintain that in a random environment is to always try and climb uphill up the probability gradients, and then almost by definition we end up spending more time in highly probable states and less time in more improbable states. And this is sort of the starting point really for active inference, because we now have this notion that we're climbing probability gradients and we have some distribution that we're effectively trying to maximize. And we can link that back to ideas like the Bayesian brain, the idea that the brain is using some model of the world around it to generate predictions, and then is drawing inferences about the data that it actually obtains, so sensory information coming in through our eyes, ears, through our skin, that we can then use to draw inferences about the causes of those data. So here we've got the idea that there's some states of the world X that are causing some sensory data Y. We're then forming some posterior beliefs, so beliefs about the causes given the data. And we're doing this using a generative model that comprises a likelihood and a prior. So prior being how plausible are the things out there in the world before we've made any observations, the likelihood being how likely the observations we've made are given the states of the world or given our hypotheses about what caused them. And together we refer to these two things as a generative model. Now, the posterior distribution is what happens when we invert that model, where we find the probability of some causes given the data. And the final term we've got at the end here is referred to either as an evidence or a marginal likelihood. And that's because in the context of Bayesian statistics, we often use a marginal likelihood as a measure of the fit of a model to the data that it's trying to explain. So how much evidence do those data afford some model of the world? And together we can think of these as being an inversion of the generative model. Now, the reason I've put this here is that we can see that the dynamics that I'm showing in the upper left can be interpreted as the process of maximizing the evidence of some model, maximizing the fit between the brain's model of how the world works and how the world then engages with the model or engages with the brain by presenting it data. And broadly, there are two ways of doing that. The first is, as we've already spoken about, is changing your beliefs based upon new data such that you get a better fit to the world. The other way, which I think is one of the key ideas in active inference, is that you generate actions based upon your beliefs that change the world to make it more like your model. And this is sort of the key idea that underwrites active inference, that all we're trying to do is maximize the evidence for some model of our world. And we can either do that through perception by changing our model, or through action by changing the world. But together they come under one single objective, sometimes referred to, particularly by people like Jakob as self-evidencing. Now, I want to go a little bit into the structure of generative models, and specifically the ways we can think about and the ways we can notate generative models. Because it often helps to move from a slightly more mathematical abstract description to a more graphical notation that I think often gives a much better intuitive sense of what's going on. So to do that, I'm going to start with this idea that model evidence is effectively what we get out once we've integrated out all of the causes from our model, by which I mean if you take account of all of the things our model predicts, and then we take into account the prior probabilities of all of the things that are causing those data, we can then work out what the probability of the data are under that model. But the model itself takes account of the things that are being generated, so our sensory data, and also the things that are causing them. Simply a joint probability distribution involving all of these things. So I'm now interpreting this graphic up on the left as depending upon some generative model where we've effectively integrated out everything that we don't need to determine explicitly. Now, generative models will often have some interesting structure, and in fact, if they don't have interesting structure, then they're not interesting generative models. And normally that structure manifests as a factorization of this joint distribution, that not everything depends upon everything else. And so we can often factorize it, and here I'm just showing a completely arbitrary factorization of some generative model, where we have certain dependencies, so y depends directly upon x1 and x2, but not directly upon x3, and so on. And the reason it's useful to think about this factorization is because we can then express a graphical version of this model that provides a bit more intuition as to what's going on. So the way we do that, or one way that we can do that, is using something known as a factor graph. And the idea is that we take each of these factors in turn, and we draw a square, and then we draw an arrow to whatever's on the left of the probability factor we're interested in. So here, an arrow towards the y, because we're saying the probability of y conditioned upon or depending upon the other two things, and then we attach those to the same square. We then move on to the next factor, draw another square, and we then attach the relevant variables together in exactly the same way. And we carry on doing that until we have a picture of what our model is like. So now, instead of having to look at this equation, you can look at this and say, okay, well, x3 causes x1, x4 causes x2, and together x1 and x2 relate to, or together generate our data y. This is just to demonstrate several models that you may be familiar with generally, and the fact that we're often implicitly using these kinds of generative models without necessarily thinking about it. So when we're performing a principal components analysis, we're often taking some distribution of some variable x, we're then mapping that to a higher dimensional space y, and that's our sort of model of how the data that we're working with are generated. So what we can then do when we perform a principal components analysis is take our high dimensional data y, work out how you go back from the y to the x, and that gives you all of your specific principal components and the directions that have been stretched in various different ways. Same principle applies for things like canonical variance analysis, where you've got some set of variables that then map to two different sorts of data by stretching them and distorting them in various ways. And the challenge is, how do you get back to the common hidden variable, the common cause for both of those data sets? And we do the same sort of thing with something like clustering analysis, where here the model says we're effectively sampling from one of several different clusters with different probabilities. We're then generating some point in space depending upon which cluster it falls in. And the process of inference is, again, undoing this. It's finding the posterior by taking a point in a cluster and saying, well, which cluster is that from? So going from the y to the s. So that's a sort of brief introduction to the idea of generative models, the role they play in active inference, some key examples, and some of the notation that I'm going to use as we go forward. What I've said so far has been relatively abstract, and in the next section I want to try and work from those sort of general principles and these slightly abstract notions through to something more specific and more neurobiological. The first thing we're going to do to get there is to introduce one more abstract concept, which is that of a Markov blanket. Now, a Markov blanket comes up in all sorts of places in active inference, but I'm going to use it in a very specific way here, and this is to talk about conditional independence. And what I mean by conditional independence is that if you have two different sets of variables, so here I've notated them as the mu and the eta, the Markov blanket B is the set of variables that render the other two completely independent of one another. That mean that if you know everything about the blanket, knowing something about mu tells you nothing new about eta. To give you an example of this, one of the examples that most people are familiar with is the idea of a Markov chain, where you have a sequence of events in time. So something that happens in the past then influences the present, which then influences the future, with no direct influence from the past to the future without going via the present. So if I know everything there is to know about the present, knowing something about the past tells me nothing new about the future, and vice versa. So in that sense, the present is the Markov blanket that separates the past from the future. Now, this is a very useful concept when we're dealing with graphical models or generative models that have some interesting factorization structure, and I'll try and explain why. The Markov blanket is often referred to as, or can often be identified by identifying variable we're interested in. So let's say we're interested in the variable x2. And then you find the parents of x2, so the things that caused it, the children of x2, so the things it causes, and the parents of its children. And that gives you the Markov blanket of x2. Now, the significance of this is that knowing this means that if we know about the blanket, it doesn't matter what else is going on in the generative model. You know, this might be some tiny section of a huge generative model with many, many variables in, but we don't need to know about all of those variables. All we need to know about are the blanket variables. So we can effectively ignore everything else if what we're interested in is x2. Now, how does this then matter for neurobiology? Well, I think the answer to that is that the brain is an extremely sparse structure, that synaptic message passing does not involve connections between every different neuron in the brain to every other neuron in the brain. There are a small number, relatively speaking, of synapses between any neuron and its neighbours or neurons elsewhere in the brain. And so we can make an argument that if the brain is performing inference about lots of different variables, all it needs is to know the structure of the generative model and the variables that sit in that Markov blanket, or at least the neurons that are representing those other variables. And that tells us that we can then, when we're inverting that model, when we're performing inference, what I'm showing here is just one example of an inference scheme. We can express the dynamics of that neuronal message passing in terms of connections from the other neural populations that are representing the variables in that Markov blanket. The details of this aren't that important, but this is one example of an inference scheme known as variational message passing, here formulated as a gradient scheme in terms of some dynamics, which has relevance for modeling neural populations where we're interested in how the dynamics of those populations evolve over time. And we can sort of do this recursively. We can couple together lots of different parts of this system where the things that are being connected up are just the Markov blankets of different populations. Here I've expressed it in terms of an error term, this epsilon, which effectively represents the gradient of a free energy objective, which is used as an approximation to that marginal likelihood or evidence that I spoke about earlier, and then some beliefs about or expectations about that variable, so we can now use the errors in our predictions to update those variables. And once we've written down the dynamics of this sort of system, we can simulate things like firing rates, we can simulate the dynamics and the behavior of these networks of neurons passing messages between one another as a means of performing a form of inference and thus self-evidencing. I know that this is probably still seeming relatively abstract, but I think what will hopefully help is if we then go through some examples thinking about specific kinds of generative model and how that might then affect the kind of message passing we would see in a brain. And the first step to thinking about that, which I think is very important when we think about really useful generative models, is they will all typically have a temporal aspect to them, that as biological creatures we deal with things that evolve in time. And so it's worth thinking about, how do you formulate a generative model that has that kind of dynamic aspect to it? And there are several different answers to that, and one of them is we use something known as a Taylor series approximation. So we start by saying, okay, at the current time, what is the value of some variable x in the world? And this may be some continuous variable, it may be where my arm is in space. If we then want to know how it's going to evolve in time, we could then say, well, let's take the next element of our Taylor series approximation, let's take account of its velocity, and that tells us a little bit more about the trajectory that my arm might be on. We can then take another value, which is the current acceleration of that position, and we get a slightly better approximation to the trajectory. And the more terms we add in, the greater an approximation we have of the trajectory, or the greater a representation we have of the trajectory, just as a series of numbers, where those numbers are my current position, my current velocity, acceleration, etc. So we could formulate a generative model by trying to predict each of these coefficients of this Taylor series, or each of these generalized coordinates of motion, as they're sometimes referred to. An alternative is we just say, at time 1, where will I be? At time 2, where will I be? And we simply represent it in terms of a sequence of points over time. often when we're discretizing time in this way, we also discretize space. So we might say, okay, where am I in some discretized scheme? Am I in location 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 at each different time point? And so we have two different ways of accounting for how things might evolve over time. And each of these can be useful in slightly different circumstances. So if I were dealing with a sequential decision-making task, it may be much more efficient for me to say, okay, the first move I'm going to make is this, then the second one is this, the third one is this, and dealing with something very sequential. That might also be important in sort of language processing, where you have to think which words you're going to put together in a sequence, and here we're dealing with discrete variables over time, because words are categorical entities as opposed to lying on a continuum. However, if I were dealing with movement or the responses I'm getting from some photoreceptor in my retina, it may be much more sensible for me to be working in continuous time and thinking about how things evolve at a continuous scale. So what I'm showing here is an example of a generative model and the associated message passing scheme when formulated in terms of this continuous time scheme. So what we've got here is a factor graph at the top, this blue element, that uses exactly the same sort of formulation that we've been discussing so far. So we have some variable here which might represent our position, which then predicts our velocity at that time, which then predicts the acceleration at that time. So we have a series of predictions here about the coupling between different orders of motion. At each point, those are predicting some sort of data. Here are y's, which represent the current position of our sensory data, the current velocity, the current acceleration. And what I'm showing lower down here is the message passing scheme we get when we take account of the Markov blankets of each of these variables. So the Markov blanket here for the velocity would include the position and the acceleration, but also the data I've got about those things and some prior beliefs about other variables in our model. And so we'd end up connecting those things up. And although it looks like a bit of a mess of connections, it's still fewer connections than the total number of connections you would get if you match everything to everything else. What we've got here takes the form of effectively a predictive coding style scheme, which people may be familiar with, and the idea that you can hierarchically predict some data, and you can predict the thing that's predicting those data, and by observing the errors in your prediction of the data, you update your prediction, which then cascades up a hierarchy, allowing you to update subsequent predictions. What I'm showing you here is the equivalent model formulated in terms of discrete time, and in this case, discrete space as well. So here we have a state at time t-1, which generates a state at time t, which generates a state at time t+1. At each of those time points, we're generating some observable outcomes, which are represented as the O's. We have a variable pi here that represents alternative trajectories I could pursue, so alternative policies or plans, alternative ways I could change the sequence of events. And again, we have underneath the message passing scheme that could perform inferences about this sort of model. And you can see that the message passing scheme to some extent looks like an inversion or is loosely a sort of mirror image of the generative model, because all it's doing is taking each step that was performed to generate some data and then inverting those steps one at a time. So it's just going backwards from the data to arrive at the causes of those data. Now, what I've got shown here on the left is just a sort of cartoon image of some of the key connections in cortical microcircuits. So here we've got superficial pyramidal cells as SP, spiny stellate cells as SS, deep pyramidal cells as DP, and inhibitory interneurons as the double I's. And this is clearly an oversimplification of what is a very complex connectivity structure. But the reason I'm showing this here is that if we know something about this connectivity structure, if we know about some of the key patterns, we can start to ask how can the sorts of models that we've spoken about over the last couple of slides then be interpreted in terms of the microcircuits that could help that could help implement these in a biological system. So what I'm going to show in the middle is an example of a continuous state-space predictive coding style model that has all the same elements as in the slide I showed you before, but are now mapped so that some of the connections coming in and out of it loosely map to those associated with a known cortical anatomy. And we can do exactly the same thing here with the discrete state-space model and think about how we can assign those roles associated with the roles of different cortical layers, and then use that as a way of forming hypotheses. Now, what I'm showing you on this slide is not necessarily the last word on this, and you could formulate several different hypotheses about how these two things map together, and that's where a lot of interesting science happens. This is just one example of how we can associate what we know about cortical microcircuitry and anatomy with what we know about the anatomy of message passing for some simple generic forms of generative model. What I'm going to try and do over the rest of this presentation is to take the connections coming out of this, out of each of these points, and to try and think about how those might, or the roles those might play when we take an active inference approach, and the sorts of structures in the brain that might be involved in dealing with those things. I'm going to start by talking about movement and reflexes. So here, the kinds of things we're interested in are the connections that leave the cortex and go to areas like the spinal cord and the motor neurons. The predictions that we can then make about the what we're seeing here is in the central plot, and the G that's been circled in red is a prediction about the sort of data I might expect to observe, which may here be proprioceptive data consequent on particular sorts of action. And we can think of this quite simply if we think about the structure of a reflex arc. So what I've got here on the lower part is just the same marginal likelihood or model evidence that we've dealt with before, this idea of it being a measure of the fit of a model, both in terms of its accuracy, the accuracy with which it predicts some data, and the simplest, least complex version of the model that will work for that. What do we do when we change the data? Well, we try and make the data more accurate in relation to our model by trying to align the data with our predictions. So when we think of the structure of a reflex arc, where we can interpret it as some descending prediction coming from the motor cortex saying what is the proprioceptive data I expect to observe, by comparing that with the proprioceptive data that's actually coming into the spinal cord through the dorsal horn with that prediction, we then get potentially a mismatch between the two that can be used to generate action via the ventral horn, generating movements and contractions in muscles that then try to fulfill these predictions. I'll show you just an example of a simulation of an arm using active inference that has these sort of reflex arcs built in. And all we're doing here is we're just tapping on the biceps tendon where the red arrow is pointing, and we're just seeing the reflexive response that we're getting as a consequence of effectively inducing this additional piece of sensory proprioceptive information. By stretching that tendon, we induce the mismatch between the prediction that's coming down and the data that's coming out, and that is corrected then by generating this additional movement. Interestingly, we can do things by manipulating the confidence of those predictions and sometimes get things like bigger reflexes and hyperreflexia of the sort you might see in clinical populations with spinal cord injuries. And so here you can see the reflex is slightly larger than it was before and slightly brisker. I'll show you another example of this same idea, where now we've developed a mapping between the microcircuit and the anatomy of the oculomotor brainstem. So here, starting from the superior colliculus, the rostral interstitial nucleus, the medial longitudinal fasciculus, and various other centers, and the cranial nerves that are responsible for generating eye movements. So cranial nerve 3 and cranial nerve 6 here are seen here as resulting from these error terms. So we're predicting how I would expect my eyes to move, and any error in the current position of the eyes is corrected by generating eye movements. So by inducing different priors on top of this model, different predictions about where I'd expect the eyes to be, we can actually then generate different sorts of eye movements using a predictive coding style active inference scheme, where the key thing is that the predictions can be fulfilled by actually changing the positions of our muscles and the positions of our eyes. So that sort of provides a very brief overview and a couple of examples dealing with the role of reflexes and predictions in generating movements, but it doesn't really tell us anything about how movements are chosen, how movements are selected, and you don't necessarily get any intelligent behavior out of that. And for that, we need to start looking at different sorts of structures and different parts of this generative model. And here, the key thing I want to focus on is the role of the basal ganglia, which here we're going to associate with the computation of something known as the expected free energy. And I'll try and describe what that is a little bit more in some of the subsequent slides. So what I'm showing here is a mapping of some of the subcortical anatomy, or more accurately, I should say that this is a mapping between parts of our Bayesian message passing scheme, parts of the model inversion when we're dealing with the ability to plan and to make decisions, to some of the known subcortical anatomy of the brain. And the key thing I want to focus on is this G that is here depicted as part of the striatum. So the things that are feeding into this are what we're getting from the cortex here, which is some prediction of the outcomes we'd expect if I were to pursue a particular course of action, which is this subscript pi, and the another sort of error term here, which is how far away are those predictions from my preferences about how the world should be, my prior beliefs about how the kind of data that I would actually actively seek out and act to get. Together, those are used to calculate our expected free energy, which we can then use to formulate beliefs about policies by saying that the policies we would select, the plans we would engage in, are those that we would expect to be associated with the lowest expected free energy. And to put that more formally, we're saying that we're going to give a prior belief that the policies, the series of actions we're going to choose, are going to be those associated with the maximum information gain that tell us the most about the world around us, that fulfill our preferences, and then we're going to add in an additional term here which deals with habitual type policies and things that we tend to do because we've learned we behave in a particular way in those situations. Now, the combination of this information gain and preferences are often referred to as an expected free energy, and I won't go into the details here, but that's simply because you can rearrange them mathematically to make them look very much like the equation for a free energy or marginal likelihood approximation, with an expectation around them to say that these are what we would expect given our predictions about the data we would obtain, because here we're dealing with beliefs about the future, plans into the future, where we haven't yet had those data, and we need to deal with the expectations of what those data would be under different plans that we could choose. So here we're showing just an example of the direct pathway through the basal ganglia, which is normally thought to facilitate movement and depends upon this expected free energy, and an indirect pathway, which here we've associated with these kinds of habitual drives, and I'll come back to those a little bit later on when we deal with hierarchical models. Just to give you a little bit of intuition as to the information gain aspect of the expected free energy, because I think most people probably understand this idea of seeking preferences and behaving to maximize some degree of reward, but many people are less familiar with the idea of seeking information and the way that that might manifest in these kinds of models. So as an example, I'm going to show you just a simple simulation where we're going to manipulate some of the different aspects of the uncertainty in the model. So here in the upper left, I'm just showing a way of parameterizing the uncertainty associated with the data generating process. So this is our likelihood precision, our sensory precision. And it effectively says that when this precision is very high, we can be very certain about the outcome we'll observe given a particular state of the world. Whereas when it's very low, we can predict everything with very similar probability. And we can do something very similar by manipulating the uncertainty in the dynamics of the world. So again, when this is very high, it means that where I am now is very highly predictive of where I'll be at the next step in time. Whereas when it's very low, it means that pretty much anything at the next time point is equally probable. And I'll show you a simple simulation where these two things are manipulated, just to try and give you an intuition for what it means to act to maximize one's information about the world. So the upper simulation here, top left, shows 4 panels which can each change at some point in time to a different color with some random probabilities. And the blue line here is designed to show effectively an eye-tracking trace. So it's a simulated agent who is allowed to choose which of these panels it wants to look at any one time. And you can see it samples them with a relatively even frequency. In the middle panel, what we've done is we've reduced the precision or increased the uncertainty associated with the likelihood in the lower left. That effectively is like turning off the lights in that location. It's effectively making that lower left location much less informative, much more noisy. And so effectively what we've got here is a system that then ignores that. It says that I can't get good quality, high quality information from there, so I'm going to look at all of the other locations rather than this in the lower left. An analogy for this is if you're thinking about how you perform a scientific experiment, you would probably aim to use, if you had a choice between 2 different measuring instruments, you would choose the one that gives you the more precise measurements rather than the one that gives you very noisy measurements. In the lower left, we've manipulated the uncertainty or the volatility associated with the dynamics. So here what's happened is the upper left location is associated with much more uncertain dynamics. So here what happens is that I end up sampling that upper left location much more frequently. And intuitively, this makes a lot of sense, because if you've looked somewhere very recently, normally you'll know a lot about what was there. You don't need to look back there anytime soon. However, if it's very volatile, if it changes quite with some degree of randomness, and you have very little certainty about the state of it after you've looked away, you'll look back with a much greater frequency. So we've effectively decreased the inhibition of return in this location by increasing its volatility or decreasing the precision associated with its with the dynamics in that location. So the aim of this was just to show you this sort of emergent behavior just by having an information-seeking objective, by having a prior belief that we're going to act to minimize some expected free energy, one component of which is to maximize our information about the world. Now, the next thing I want to come on to is the role of hierarchical generative models. And one of the key benefits of having a hierarchical model is that we can now deal with things that evolve over a range of different timescales. So we might have some things that evolve very slowly and some things that evolve very quickly. And to some extent, we can separate out the two and use slowly evolving things to help us predict what's happening at the faster level. And here the key things to note are all of these connections between higher cortical regions and lower cortical regions, which manifest both in the discrete and continuous state space models. And so it's worth then thinking about what the role of these are and how that manifests in terms of the generative models we've been dealing with before. And it's really this that links back into the idea of predictive coding as many people know it. And you've probably seen graphics of this sort in the past, where we have a range of cortical regions that are each making predictions about the others. So here, going from the right to the left, we've got a series of predictions as these dark black lines, with prediction errors passed back up using these dashed lines that then allow us to correct at each level. And all this graphic shows is a simplification of the graphic on the previous slide. So I want to give you an intuition for why this is useful using a couple of examples. So the first example I'm going to use is one from the domain of active vision. So imagine you're doing a task now where you have to fixate on this cross in the center and maintain that fixation. I'm going to show you a stimulus, but maintain fixation on the cross. Stimulus is going to disappear. And then your next task is to perform an eye movement to the location where the stimulus appeared. A very simple task of the sort that's used frequently in monkey electrophysiology and all throughout neuroscience. But it's an interesting one because it has several different components to it that I think help in terms of thinking about the utility of hierarchical models. So one aspect of this is making decisions about where you're looking at each of those time points and making inferences about which of several alternative locations you're going to perform an eye movement to. So a simple form of planning here. So that calls into action the sort of discrete state-space model that we were dealing with before, this partially observed Markov decision process, this set of discrete sequential time points. And that's often very highly relevant structure of most simple tasks in cognitive neuroscience. However, we also need to actually move our eyes. We need to move our eyes from one location to the next. We need to know how to generate forces. We need to know how to make sure the eyes come to rest in the right location given those decisions. And that calls into play this sort of continuous state-space predictive coding style model. So how do we then combine the two? How do we deal with the situation where we want to predict a particular location at a discrete level, one of several alternatives, but then also map that to a continuous motor trajectory? And this is where generative models get a little bit more complicated. So taking this a bit at a time, what we've got at the top here is our Markov decision process model. This is our discrete state-space model in discrete time. Now, at each of those time points, we're no longer predicting data specifically. We're now predicting a short trajectory formulated in terms of our continuous state-space models. So at time one, we're now going to predict a short element of our trajectory. And this is very much like the sort of clustering model I showed you much earlier, that you take a discrete point and you map it to a point in continuous space with some probability. At the next time, we then predict the next bit of that continuous trajectory. So our priors for our continuous model are now inheriting from the predictions from the discrete state-space model. And then we can do the same thing again at the next time point. And so we can create a discrete sequence from our sequential model. And at each point in that sequence, associate that with a short trajectory in continuous space that then predicts our continuous data, allowing us to then predict the proprioceptive information we would expect to get from the eyes when we're performing a task of this sort. And you can see that we now develop a hierarchical structure also in thinking about the relationship between the bits of the message passing scheme. So here we've got the discrete bit of our message passing scheme, our discrete microcircuit, and a bit of the continuous microcircuit here, and the interactions between the two of those, where we're making predictions from the discrete one to the continuous one, and then passing errors backwards to allow us to update the discrete element. So interpreting this again neurobiologically, we can imagine that, say, we have some element of the cortex, perhaps the frontal eye fields, that's making predictions about one of several alternative locations I could direct my gaze. We can then map that via sort of output of the basal ganglia and the predictions about what policy I'm going to pursue, through to areas like the superior colliculus, which then might make use of predictive coding style networks of the sort depicted here to then generate eye movements as we've seen before. And just to show you that in action, we imagine that these are a population of neurons that at each time point are trying to predict one of several, in this case, 3 different locations at 4 different time points. We can then map that through structures like the superior colliculus, and this is supposed to sort of cartoon the idea of a population code in the superior colliculus that then results in the eye movement to each of those discrete locations. Putting it all together, we can then formulate exactly the task that I asked you to perform earlier, and see the result of an active inference scheme performing that task. And so here you can see it performs it very successfully by predicting sequences of eye movements that are conditioned upon the discrete part of the model and the idea of maintaining this belief about where the stimulus appeared and using that then to direct my policy selection and eventually the movement I select. want to give you one more example of this sort of hierarchical scheme in the domain of motor control, and to appeal to the same sort of simulations we were looking at earlier in terms of the reflexes exhibited by that arm. The generative model we're going to use here is a slightly complicated one, but here effectively involves transitions between different locations that an arm could be in, or a hand could be in, which then predicts different locations in some continuous space, and different locations that a target might be in. And that will then allow us to make predictions about given where some target is in some continuous space, which decision am I going to make about the alternative points I could move my arm to. And so here we have the simulation where we have the target appearing as the black ball out of the three balls, which is going to change at various points in time. And our active inference scheme is now selecting these locations, translating those into predictions of continuous trajectories, and making the appropriate movements such that it reaches each of these target locations. And what's shown in terms of the graphic here is also an interpretation of message passing in terms of the known anatomy of the motor system, or part of it. We can perform various lesions to this and see whether they behave in the same way that we might expect patient populations to. So here we've induced a cerebellar lesion, which effectively involves a misestimation of certain precision terms, certain confidence or variance parameters. And you see this sort of overshoot and this kind of oscillatory behavior in the way the arm behaves that mimics what we might expect in a cerebellar ataxia. We can look at the higher levels of the model and actually have multiple hierarchical levels of the discrete scheme. And here what we've done is we've induced a lesion in what might represent a frontal lobe lesion, where now the model is able to perform all the movements with perfect fluency, but every time there's a change of context, it takes quite a while to adjust to that new context, to deal with a new situation. And you'll see that instead of moving straight there as it was before, there's a lot more hesitancy and a lot more difficulty constructing that long-term narrative because we've broken that slower hierarchical level. And here, a final lesion that we can introduce is one that reduces my confidence in policy selection. So here this effectively makes me very uncertain about what I'm going to do next. And here we get a sort of akinetic type picture of the sort we might expect in a Parkinsonian type syndrome. So I realise that was quite a lot, and I hope I'm not too far over time, but I'll just try and summarise briefly the key ideas that we've discussed. So the first was thinking about this idea of climbing probability gradients, the idea that to maintain some form over time and to persist, we need to effectively be climbing these probability gradients all the time. We interpreted those probability gradients in terms of Bayes' theorem and connected that to the Bayesian brain and the sort of message passing that might be involved in forming inferences about elements of some generative model and the role that might have in cortical microcircuitry. We also discussed the role of action and the idea that one way to make our model better fit the world is to act upon it, and one way to do that is to simply reduce any discrepancy between the predictions from that model and the data that's coming in. And the structure of that is very similar to the idea of a reflex arc, as is well known throughout motor neuroscience. And the final thing we thought about was how we can then construct hierarchical models that allow us to produce simulations and theories of that deal with much larger scale networks in the brain and take a full sort of systems level view of how particular movements and particular behaviors are generated through the inversion of particular forms of generative model. With that, I'd like to thank many people who've been involved either directly or indirectly in this work. I'll mention the book again, which was mentioned at the beginning. A lot of this talk was loosely following some of the structure in a couple of the chapters in the book. So if anybody's interested, please do take a look. More than happy to answer any questions. Thank you for your attention.